Still got people trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you everybody for coming for tonight's program on Irish women. And we are very happy to have Sean back with us again. Sean Murphy has come to do a number of our Irish history programs with us over the last few weeks. If you haven't seen any of his talks with us before, we do have them archived on YouTube, and I would highly recommend going to take a look at them. I do just very quickly want to take a moment to thank the Friends of the Library, whose work for us have made programs like this possible. They do a tremendous amount for us, and without their support, we would not be able to run nearly as many of these wonderful programs that you've all come to love. I just want to let you know that tomorrow we are having the next session in our series on smartphone photography. And then on Thursday, we are having another session with Cooking with Colin. So if you're interested in attending any of those programs, you can find the links for those on our website and on our calendar. This is just a reminder. Sean is going to be taking questions at the end of the presentation. If something comes up during the course of the presentation, you can certainly message me and we'll make sure that we get the question to him at the end of his presentation. But please save all of your questions on the end. And for anybody on Facebook who are watching us live or on YouTube, please submit your questions there and we'll make sure he sees those as well. So thank you very much, and thank you, Sean, for coming in.
Well, thank you, Carrie, and welcome everybody. I would start off slowly, as I can see a few people are still joining us. So just a little bit about me. I'm from Ireland. I've been in the States for the last 15 years, and I've been teaching courses at the Irish Cultural Centre in Canton and various other centres. Since the coronavirus, I've been doing a lot of work online, and my next classes which will begin in September, but I'll be introducing you to those a little bit later on. So the first thing, what to expect tonight, I'm going to be giving you a presentation using PowerPoint. So you should be seeing PowerPoint, not me. So if for some reason when I screen share, it doesn't work, please send an email or send a chat message to Carrie, and she will sort that out. So before I begin, just to let you know a couple of things. Obviously, the topic would take a long time to cover in great detail, so it's going to be sketchy. It's an attempt to provide you with an interview of women in Irish history since the earliest days up to basically up to the beginning of the 20th century. So there's a lot in there. I can only select a few individuals. I'm trying to periodize the history roughly into ancient Irish history up to the beginning then of Christianity, and then after that the next period would be that I would deal with the period from when Ireland was invaded from our neighboring island, England. The fourth period, if you like, if you are going to do a study of this history, the role of women post-independence in Ireland, because I won't be dealing with the issue of women in Ireland post-independence tonight. So it's a general history, and I'll be trying to give you a sense of what happened over that in terms of the development of Ireland as a country, and in particular the role that women played. So just to be clear, I don't make any claim in the hour that I'm going to do tonight to give you anything that would be a scholarly or a comprehensive review. It wouldn't be possible. What I will try to do is to introduce you in a way that hopefully you will find interesting, and I'll be introducing you to some of the legends and historical facts about Ireland, and that should give you a window for questions possibly at the end, as well as any study that you may wish to do on Irish history on your own following this. So I'm going I'm going to go to screen share now, if I can get up here. You should see now in a moment is the screen should be a slide that says Women in Irish History. So let me just. Kerry, if you're there, I'm not too sure what happened there with the screen share. Let me go back in here and that, and we'll start the share again. Something.
Yeah, it looked like it just froze for a second. I don't know what happened.
Yeah. Okay, let's see if this will bring it up. Try doing a new share. Okay, we'll try it again. It's just not giving me the screen share. It's telling me that I'm screen sharing. What can you see, Kerry? Can you see the presentation?
I can see just your web browser. I was able to see the screen that said Zoom on it.
Okay. Sorry, folks, I'm not too sure what to do here. Unfortunately, it's putting the screen with all of the commands right over where I need to be able to see what. Okay, I'll try this. Okay.
Sean, Clayton's coming on now. It says, someone said there's a message that says the host disabled participant screen share. So he's going to come in and take a look at it. Okay. Sorry, folks. You can just bear with us for a couple of minutes.
Hey, Sean, I understand you're having some technical difficulties.
Okay, now, yeah, so something happened there. What can you see right now?
So, Clayton, someone in the chat said that they're seeing on their end, it says a message that says the host disabled participant screen share.
Nope, we see your screen now, Sean. You're good to go.
But when he goes to open up the presentation further, that's when it was freezing.
It could be what you're actually sharing, but
Yeah.
that looks good now to me.
Okay.
Yeah, no, part of the problem is that for some reason they've changed the format again on the page. So all of the menu that you get from Zoom covers the top of your screen.
They do like to play with us, make our lives difficult, don't they?
So sorry, folks. Let's get started. So I just put a couple of the names that are often that are known to refer to people, some legendary, some real in Irish history. Scotia, Eru, from which we get Era and Aaron. Fola, Banba, they were two queens in Ireland in ancient times. Queen Maeve, Bridget. We had Saint Bridget as well as a goddess Bridget, as well as a pagan goddess Bridget. Then we had Gráinne Whale, and there are many more. So just a quick overview. So the first thing, even though the world is about 4.6 billion years old, and Ireland was formed about 400 million years ago, there's only positive evidence of human settlement in Ireland from about 12,500 years ago, roughly the end of the last ice age. We do know that the first people in Ireland were hunter-gatherers, and then after about 6,000 years ago, farming began, and some historians call that transition, the one from hunter-gatherer to farming, is the most profound revolution in human history. The Bronze Age began in Ireland about 4,500 years ago, the Iron Age about 2,500 years ago, and St. Patrick arrived about 1,600 years ago. Just a quick glimpse. A quick overview then of women and women's role. Women have been active and have had important roles at all levels, particularly in ancient Irish society, more so than at any other stage in Irish history, possibly even up to today. Following conversion then to Christianity in the 5th century AD, gradually women were placed in auxiliary and subordinate roles. And that continued as the, if you like, we call it Celtic Christianity rose. And then around the 12th century, we had the invasion from the Normans, and from, mainly coming from the island of England, but the king at the time was a Norman. And part of that was the conquest of Ireland for economic reasons and security reasons, but also there was a religious element to it. And one of that was to try to reform the religion in Ireland from loosely described as the Celtic Christianity to a more standardized form in line with Rome. And under that, then women's roles and women's position in society deteriorated further. So they were limited and subordinate to men. And in fact, under English common law, women and their children became the property of their husbands. Until 1970, that a Commission on the Status of Women was established. And it was from this time, only 50 years ago, that women began to regain some of the rights that were lost over the millennia. So a number of that we have from Ireland gave their names to Ireland. One was Scotia, who was the legendary wife of the King of the Milesians, who are known as the founders of Gaelic Ireland. She gave her name to ancient Ireland. The Romans and Julius Caesar referred to Irish people as Scoties, and that was a reference to Scotia. And in fact, the Scot in Scotland comes from her. Other names included Eru, Banba, and Fola. And to give you an idea of the roles that they played, in the battle for control of Ireland at the time that Ireland became Gaelic Ireland, the two leaders were women, Queen Scotia and Queen Eru, and both of those died in the battle and both of those at times have been associated with Ireland. Queen Eru more so, because Ireland in the 1937 Constitution, the name for the island of Ireland was Éire, which comes from her. And then a lot of people know Ireland as Éireann, and we have the name Éireann as well, and they all come from Eru. Just give you some images that we have. Now, obviously, there's no necessary relation to reality here, but one woman that I haven't got time to go into in detail was Talchu, a very important woman in terms of the establishment of social and religious ceremonies in Ireland. The middle one is Scotia, and she was, as I said earlier, the wife of the King of Milesians, and then Eru. Then we have Queen Maeve, which I'll be dealing with here, and I'll be profiling her. St. Bridget also I'll be profiling, and then Grace OMalley, known as the Pirate Queen. So I'm going to go back a long way into history. First of all, the first legal case from ancient Ireland, which establishes that women had rights, goes back 4,700 years ago. And on the right-hand side here is a stone that is on an island in Donegal that immortalizes that event. So it's known as the first judgment that we have, that is referred to in the ancient Irish texts, and it demonstrates that under the Irish Brehon laws, women had rights. The Partholonians, they were the first of the Celtic tribes to arrive in Ireland around 2700 BC. Their leader was Partholon, and they settled on an island in Donegal that was later called Inish. Inish is an Irish word, and it means island or peninsula, and Samir. Now it is claimed that he named the island Samir after his wife Dalganet's dog, which he killed in a fit of jealousy or rage. What had happened was, sometime after they arrived in Ireland, he went and left his wife when he went on a sortie around the territory. Apparently, she had a fancy to a warrior, and in his absence, let's put it this way, they had a little fun. Partholon found out about it and killed her dog in a rage. As was her right, she took legal action against her husband for the death of the dog. So her husband tried to get around it, first of all, by naming the island after the dog, but she insisted on going ahead with the case. And the judge, the word Brehon is an old Irish word, which simply means judge. And the judge made a judgment in her favor. And in his favor, in his judgment, this is what was, it's claimed was cited, and it's what we have in some of the ancient recordings. So basically it boiled down to the judge finding him negligent. And it said it was like leaving honey before a woman, milk before a cat, edged tools before a craftsman, or meat before a child. So in other words, it was his misdoings, and so he was not going to, so she won the case. Going to move on to then to a very famous woman in Irish medieval history, mythological history, Queen Maeve of the province of Connacht, which is possibly the most famous female character. So she was reputed to have been the Queen of Connacht around the time of Jesus Christ. And a lot of the work that we have from that period, its context is understood to be the Ulster cycle of Irish mythology. Now, in these, our husband in the core stories of the Ulster cycle is Ailill Mac Mata. Mac is the Irish word for son, because before they were hereditary surnames, you were the son of whoever, or O, which meant that you were the grandson or descendant of. So he was, in the core story anyway, he was her husband, although she had several husbands before him. The polygamy and divorce were part of Irish social life at the time. And he was a king, she was a queen. Now, in these stories, she's the enemy and the former wife of Conor MacNessa, who was king of Ulster, and is best known for his part in a very, very famous Irish book or story, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, which translates into the cattle raid of Cooley. And in that story, what happened was Maeve and her husband compared their wealth, and what they discovered, or what she discovered, that the only difference between the two of them was that he had a bull, and that the bull was worth quite a lot. So she needed to match his wealth by getting another bull. So she set out to steal a prized bull from Ulster. And so that's what the Táin Bó Cúailnge is all about. I don't have time to go into the details of it here, but you can get copies of that, or you can get the story online. So how Maeve came to power in Connacht and how she married Ailill MacMada, it's told in another old text, the Cát Poinde, which translates into the Battle of the Boyne. No connection there with the Battle of the Boyne that happened in 1690. Now, her father, we'll just call him Ockid for the moment, he was the High King of Ireland, and he married her to Conor or Concabar Mac Nessa, who was the King of Ulster at the time. And he did that because he had killed Conor, Concabar's father, who had been the former High King of Ireland in battle. So I suppose was trying to mend some fences. She bore him a son, but the marriage was a bad one and she left him. Then Ockid, I suppose, feeling that he had to keep things right with Concabar, agreed to give him another of his daughters, Etna, but Maeve apparently murdered her while she was pregnant. At that stage, Ockid deposed the then King of Connacht, which is a province of Ireland, Teenie Mac Conroy, would be, I suppose, if you know any Conroys today, they would date back to this group. And he installed Maeve in his place. And apparently over time, Maeve and Teenie became lovers, so he ended up with a share of the throne in the province. The story gets even seedier though, because Concabar, who is now her ex-husband, apparently raped Maeve at an assembly at Tara, and a war then ensued between the High King, who was her father, and Ulster. Her husband challenged Conor, who had raped her, to single combat, but he lost. And at this stage, Ockid, who had been Tenie's rival for the kingship, what he did was he protected the Connacht army of Maeve as it retreated, and he then became Maeve's next husband and King of Connacht. Now, for Maeve, she demanded that her husband satisfy 3 criteria. That he be without fear, meanness, or jealousy. And obviously the last one would have been hard for any of them. The last for her was particularly important, as she had many lovers. And while married to Ockid, she took Ailill MacMada, who was chief of her bodyguard, as her lover. Ockid her husband discovered the affair, challenged the bodyguard to single combat, and lost. So Ailill then married Maeve and became King of Connacht. Maeve then and Ailill, they had 7 sons, and they all eventually ended up being called Main. Now, they originally all had different names, but Maeve asked a druid which of her sons was going to kill Concabar. Now, remember, at this stage, he had been a husband of hers. After she had divorced him, he had raped her, and obviously she wanted, to settle the score with him. So she asked the druid which of her sons would kill this fella, and he replied Main. Now, at the time, she didn't have a son called Main. So what she did was she renamed all her sons and gave them the name of Main. And the prophecy was fulfilled when one of them, Main and Doe, went on to kill him. Maeve and Ailill also had a daughter, Finnebar. Now, there's a lot more if you are interested in the story. As you can see, there's a lot of exciting, moments in that. How much of it is true, we'll never know. But again, let's look at what the purpose of that might be and how we know about it. So we may never know how accurate that portrayal of Maeve is, but what it does indicate is that in ancient Ireland, not only could women be queens, but that they could lead armies, be warriors and druids, possess wealth and property in their own right, and engage in marriage on an equal footing with their husbands. And it's because we have these ancient writings, which are the oldest in Europe. There's no other European country that has the depth of these old texts and old stories, many which survived in the oral tradition and were written down and were passed on over the centuries. So what's interesting, though, is that the people who began to write these stories down were monks, were Christian monks. And the first most famous attempt at writing Irish history was done about 10 years after St. Patrick was in Ireland, when he brought together a group of 9 people whose job it was to bring people in and record the history that they had to give. But the problem was anything that they would say that wasn't something that could be reconciled with Christianity had to be left out. So in terms of Maeve's story, then we know that they would have culled a lot out of the stories that were being told to them. So we don't know what there was, but the fact that we have so much is testament at least to how highly she was regarded by the Irish people, that they just simply could not write her out of history. But I suppose the sting in the tale is that the story, if you like, from the story, she didn't escape unscathed, because the story focuses not on her good deeds, but on the perceived weaknesses of women. She is depicted as headstrong, ambitious, promiscuous, greedy, jealous, and vengeful. Everything a good Christian woman should not be. So that's something to take into account when we read these stories. We have to try to contextualize them and hope that we can figure something about them that tells us enough so that we can have some idea of what went on in reality. Also, then it gives us a clue into the ideology, if you like, of the writers, why they would have focused upon that aspect of woman as against looking. And I suppose somebody could say, well, maybe she never did any good, but we don't know. Just a note on the issue of equality. One thing we do know from all of the ancient writings, and some of them are writings that were recorded before St. Patrick came to Ireland. So women were entitled to enter all the same professions as men. They could be druids, poets, physicians, lawgivers, teachers, warriors, leaders, even queens. And the mythological stories that we have are littered with such references to women of power. Also, it's interesting to note that there were 2 famous legendary mythological heroes in Ireland, and many of you may have heard of them, Cuchulainn and Finn McCool. Both of them were taught their warrior skills by women. So I'm going to move on now to the next kind of phase, which came with Christianity. And the most famous woman from the Christian period, the early Christian period, is without doubt Saint Bridget. And a common saying in Ireland is "Bríd agus Muragith," which means Bridget and Mary be with you. That's a shrine and well from the place that she was born in County Louth. So Naomh Bríd, or Saint Bridget, known as Bridie, Mary of the Gaels, and even as Biddy. She was born in 451 AD. Her father was a practicing pagan, and he named his daughter Bridget after the pagan goddess Bridget. She's one of the patron saints of Ireland, along with St. Patrick and St. Columba, or St. Columkill. She's the patron saint for dairymaids, cattle, midwives, Irish nuns, and newborn babies. Her father was a pagan Gaelic chieftain named Duffy, which translates into Duffy. Her mother was a Christian named Bercassa. She was originally from Lusitania, which would be basically Portugal today, and was kidnapped by Irish pirates and brought to Ireland to work as a slave. So therefore, her mother was a slave. That meant that she was a slave. She was born into slavery. Now, what happened then was when Duffy's wife found out that the slave girl was pregnant with Bridget, well, she was sold. When she was about 10 years old, Bridget was returned to her father's home as he was her legal master, because in those days there was no distinction between legitimate and illegitimate children. And as throughout most of history, men could benefit from the fact that they had daughters. So she was returned to her father's home. Now, one of the characters that's portrayed about her is her charitable disposition. Probably a lot of that was written around the 7th century, and it may have been part of an attempt to give her a profile, but we don't know. The stories that we hear is that she once gave her mother's entire store of butter to the poor. And then with her father, she continued when she had to go back at the age of 10. And she was giving away her father's possessions to anyone who apparently she thought needed them. Now, eventually, her father, he became tired of this charitable nature. And what he did was he took her to the King of Leinster with the intention of selling her. And as he spoke to the King of Leinster, Bridget gave his jeweled sword to a beggar, apparently so that he would be able to barter it for food for his family. Now, the king, in fact, was a Christian. When he saw this, the story is that he recognized her heart and he convinced her father to grant her freedom by saying her merit before God is greater than ours. One of the characteristics of ancient Irish society was that if you were a slave, you could be moved out of that state, and if you were born above a slave, you could end up becoming a slave. So it wasn't a caste society as in, say, India. People could social mobility, if you like, was possible. So she was able to then convince the king, or the king convinced her father to free her. So after being freed, the first thing she did was she went to try and get her mother freed. So she returned then to the druid where her mother was. Her mother was in charge of the druid's dairy. If you read the stories, a lot of the stories, particularly ones that were written by the Christian church, they talk about miracles that Bridget carried out. But the reality was that she had learned a lot of skills, and she was, very, she had good management skills. And what she did was she managed to improve the productivity on the farm. Even though she was giving away milk, the dairy itself prospered, and would eventually, being impressed with her abilities, eventually freed her mother, Broca. At least that's what we're led to believe. The other feature of Bridget is chastity, and I'm just going to use that as an introduction to the phenomenon, and probably one of the reasons why Christianity was successful in Ireland at the time. Now, Bridget, she returned then to her father after freeing her mother. At this stage, he had arranged for her to marry a bard, and she refused. And she made a vow to always be chaste, to be a bride of Christ. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but with the arrival of Christianity, this was one of the aspects of Christianity that was very liberating for women and revolutionary. The idea that they could promise themselves to Christ, and by doing so, being able to get out of the traditional role that women were expected to have, and also to be, if you like, have your future decided by your father. Now, the way that women did this, and it wasn't just in Ireland, it was in other countries as well. They basically had to go through and basically maim themselves so that they wouldn't be attractive to a man. So legend has it that Bridget prayed that her beauty be taken as so that no one would want to marry her. And we're told the prayer was granted. She lost the sight in one eye. And also we're told it wasn't until after she made her final vows that her eyesight or her beauty was restored. Now, as you could imagine, an Irish maiden was a very valuable asset to any father. She could be used to settle boundary disputes, end wars, and in general, enrich a parent. In Christianity, women found a new way, becoming a bride or a virgin of Christ, which was a revolutionary way. So by promising her body and soul to God, that, as you might imagine, was a very serious threat to the established tradition in Ireland. But for many women, it offered a much more attractive option to the cycle that left them permanently pregnant. St. Patrick, in his writings, he refers to the reactions of their parents and society, I suppose, in general. And he says, many of them, and he's talking about the women here, many of them do so against the wishes of their parents. Indeed, their families sometimes punish them cruelly and make all sorts of horrible accusations against them. That's in one of the two documents that he wrote. Patrick tells us that the growing number of those choosing celibacy, it included widows and even married women. So we just have a quick look at early medieval women, you know, in Ireland, because things began to change. The reaction to this Bride of Christ phenomenon was changed, and then over the next 500 years, women's position began to be changed. Now, again, the histories of early medieval European women, it's very hard to find. The official ideologies of their cultures, and we're talking here of other countries in Europe, were generally clerical and male. It was only people in monasteries who were doing the writing, and most of the ones who were writing were male. And here's a quote for you that kind of describes it. It says, obscuring female experiences beneath the distortions of highly gendered Christian attitudes. Now, even today, there's only one major modern monograph of female roles and representations in early medieval Ireland. You know, so as in a lot of places, we don't really have much about what the experience of women is told from a woman's point of view. Now, in the modern monograph that I referred to there, Lisa Patel, who wrote it, she emphasizes, and this is what she says, it gives you an idea of how obscure things are. She said, we must search for the female voice in textual silences and discontinuities, locating clearances in the jungle growth of ecclesiastical literature. So again, she's making the point, you know, we don't have a woman. So I'm going to now have go back a little bit and go into some detail about women's role in early Christian. So as I said earlier on, that kind of revolution in terms of women seeing a liberation from the roles by getting involved with the church. So that kind of revolt, it appears that much of the revolt, the first thing I suppose we could say is that the revolt of women in early Christian period in Ireland, it originated in, and I'm giving you a quote here from, and by the way, anybody who wants a copy of this presentation, and at the bottom of the pages, I have the references for these, please let me or Kerry know and we'll get it to you. So it originated in the radical demands of early Christian women who rejected the role stereotyping of the later Roman Empire. And what's important about the later Roman Empire, it wasn't until the early 4th century that the persecution of Christians stopped. And it wasn't until later in that century that the Christian religion was decriminalized. And by the end of that century, around the time that St. Patrick was born, the church in Rome, they call it, it was the Universal Church, the Catholic Church. It became the official church of the Roman Empire. So we're talking then about what was emanating from the Empire and the roles that, you know, the stereotyping of the roles. So they were revolting against that. So it wasn't, they weren't against the Irish traditions that allowed polygamy and divorce and which protected women's property rights. What was coming from at this stage from the Roman Empire, which was at this stage in terminal decline, was the opposite. They were trying to get rid of polygamy, get rid of divorce, and subordinate women, which, so the revolt then in itself, it did, that being said about Ireland, that it wasn't primarily against Irish traditions, but obviously it did have implications, particularly for fathers and for the clans who relied upon marrying daughters to selected husbands to increase the power and prestige of the family and the clan. So the revolt, as you can imagine, it wasn't to last. Liberation became institutionalization as women entered into closed convents and took on charitable works. And in general, female freedom then became circumscribed. So the Bride of Christ revolt was followed by basically a male-directed reaction to take that power away. And gradually then, the male superiors in the church, they relegated women's roles to that of auxiliary and subordinated them to the male leadership of the church in Ireland. Just to give you an idea, because again, I don't have time to go into it in detail, but just to let you know at the extremes. So as most reactionary at this time, there was an attempt to silence women by laying all the blame for infidelity and promiscuity upon them. And early Christian writers commonly argued that women should remain silent. And this was what they said. They referred to women as talkative women. And it was believed that they would open more than their mouth and could lure these unsuspecting, innocent men into sin. The kind of nonsense that, well, unfortunately, we still hear some of it today. Now, Irish women then under English law, I'd spend a little bit of time under that. So English law defined the role of a wife as a femme covert. Now, that term emphasized her subordination to her husband and putting her under the protection, this is a quote from the text, put her under the protection and influence of her husband, her baron, or lord. Upon marriage, the husband and wife became one person under the law, as the property of the wife was surrendered to her husband and her legal identity ceased to exist, known as coverture. Any personal property acquired by the wife during the marriage, unless specified that it was for her own separate use, went automatically to her husband. Now in Ireland, the Norman invasion happened in 1169, and for the next 300 years or so, the Irish held their own. English law was introduced. A lot of the time it wasn't enforceable, and it wasn't enforceable at times during that 300 years, but the fact that it was there, it was available then for use in the years after, when eventually English law overtook and supplanted Irish law. And even though in the 13th, 14th century, English law didn't hold sway apart from a small area on the east coast of Dublin, but the fact that they claimed the right to rule the land meant that after they had actually defeated the Irish and had replaced totally Irish law by English law, well, then they could kind of backdate everything, as you might imagine. So just a few examples. If a woman writer had copyright before marriage, the copyright would pass to the husband afterwards. Further, a married woman was unable to draft a will or dispose of any property without her husband's consent. Anne Chambers, who wrote a book about Grace OMalley that I'll be talking about later, she writes that gradually but insidiously, the role of women was confined to childbearing, engaging in charitable deeds for which they were occasionally lauded in the Irish annals, and being subservient to their husband. And now she would have been talking about the women who were in the higher echelons of Irish society. Now, in contrast to wives, then we had this Femme Soul. So in contrast to wives, women who never married or who were widowed maintained control over the property and inheritance, owned land, and controlled property disposal, since by law, any unmarried adult female was considered to be a Femme Soul. Now, once married, the only way that a woman could reclaim property was through widowhood. And it wasn't until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882 that changed. So the dissolution of marriage, whether initiated by the husband or the wife, usually left the divorced females impoverished, as the law offered them no rights to marital property. And marital property included your children. In 1836, Caroline Norton, there was a court case after her. It highlighted the injustices of English property laws and generated enough support that eventually resulted in the Married Women's Property Act of 1882. Now I'm going to go on to Gráinne Ní Mháille. There's a statue of her. She was born in 1530 and she died 1603, the same year as Queen Elizabeth I. So it's Gráinne Ní Mháille, which translates into Gráinne OMalley, or anglicized as Grace O'Malley. She was Lord of the OMalley dynasty in the west of Ireland. She's a well-known historical figure, and she is historical. Some of the earlier figures that I talked to you about, we're not sure if there's any basis in history, but they certainly are. Some people certainly would say, but it's again, for a lot of people, unless you have documentary evidence to support a claim, which obviously very difficult to produce in relation to say 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, because there is no documents, and any documents that were available were destroyed in the last 2,000 years. First of all, they were destroyed. Many of them were destroyed by the Christian Church, and then when England came to Ireland, all the old manuscripts that they could find were destroyed. So local folklore down in the west of Ireland had it that as a young girl, Gráinne wished to go on a trading expedition to Spain with her father, because they controlled the seas on the west of Ireland. And upon being told she could not, her father told her she couldn't because her long hair would catch in the wind's ropes. She cut off most of her hair, apparently to embarrass her father into taking her. And he accepted that there was no way he was going to stop her. So she went and she earned a nickname, Gráinne Ní Mháille. So Mháille is a word it's an Irish word meaning bald or having cropped hair. And that's one thought in relation to the origin of her name. The second one, that it may come from her family name, which was Mháille. So you can take your pick on which one to believe. Now, upon her father's death, she took over the active leadership of the lordships of the area by land and sea, despite having a brother, which was unusual, because usually it was the sons. In Ireland, as in most places, it was unusual for property to pass into the hands of a daughter. So 1593, in a letter to Queen Elizabeth I, the Sir Richard Bingham, he claimed he was the president, or the Lord President, of the province of Connacht, and he was tasked with controlling the local lords, who up to that point had been autonomous, and obviously they rebelled against that. So in his letter in 1593, he claimed that she was, and this is from his letter, nurse to all rebellions in the province for this 40 years. So she had every reason, and she used every opportunity to limit the power of the Kingdom of Ireland over her part of the country. Now, the Kingdom of Ireland, when Henry VIII came to Ireland, well, you may know that he had some family issues to deal with, and the original passing of Ireland to English kings was done through Rome, through the Pope, who at the time was actually an Englishman. He was the only English Pope ever, and he granted Ireland as a gift to Henry I. Now, by the time that Henry VIII came along, and because he was breaking with Rome, because that was the issue there, he no longer wanted to accept the rule of Rome. Now, he couldn't rely upon the fact that Rome had given Ireland to Henry I. So what he did was he declared Ireland to be a kingdom, and that he was the king of Ireland, and he did all of the work that he had to do to manage that. So in 1593 then, when her two sons and her half-brother were captured by the English governor, she sailed to England to petition Queen Elizabeth for their release. And she was granted a meeting at which she refused to bow, which was probably the only one who never bowed, because she didn't recognize her as the Queen of Ireland. And there's just an image of what that meeting might have looked like. So she had the meeting, and apparently the two of them got on well, and she got her relatives released, but it didn't work well. The Bingham, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Connacht, did not like the fact that she, I suppose you would say, went over his head by going to the Queen. So he made life a misery for her, and she died a number of years later. By this stage, anyway, she was getting on in years, and she died the same year as Queen Elizabeth I. So I'm going to now, this is the final section that I'm going to be dealing with, and I'm going to be looking at women in the struggle for national independence. There's a few main aspects of that in the lead up to the War of Independence. The War of Independence started in 1919. So during the 19th century, after the famine, we had the formation of the Land League, which was an organization that was set up to try to get the land of Ireland returned to the people of Ireland, and women were very active in that. Also, the Gaelic Revival, the suffragette movement, the Common Amon, which translates into Irish Women's Association, and then we had the 1916 Easter Rising and the War of Independence, and women were involved in all of those. So for much of the Irish history since the 17th century, it was at the beginning of the 17th century that Ireland was for the first time taken and controlled by England, because at that stage there was no Great Britain. It wasn't until 1707 that Scotland and England joined together in a union. So in 1610, after the English had defeated the old Irish chieftains and had forced them out of the country or killed them, then they confiscated all of their lands. And not only did they confiscate the lands of the chieftains, they confiscated the lands of the commoners as well. There was a very famous judgment in, I think it was 1608, and the court said, essentially what it said was, we know that all of you participated in this. It wasn't just the lords and the old Irish chieftains. You were all in it together. So we're not only going to take their lands, we're taking all of your land. And that was the origin of the plantation of Ulster, which is the origin of the problems that we've had in Ireland and continue to have, because Ireland, as a result of that, has been divided for the last 100 years. So the division then in Ireland were the result of the introduction of settlers, because that's what they did. After they took the land off the Irish in Ulster, they brought in settlers. And that was happening at the time of the Reformation. So the divisions then that were introduced meant that you had women in Ireland and women in England who, because of religion and because of confiscation of land and the change of legal systems and social systems, people were divided, and women were divided along all those lines: religious, ideological, social, and economic. So I'm just going to have a quick look at the the Great Hunger or the famine. And one of the most interesting and famous women at the time was Anna Parnell. So the events of the 1840s devastated Ireland. We know that period, and we understand that period as the Great Hunger or famine. The debate there is, a lot of people's point is that there wasn't a famine because there was plenty of food in Ireland. The problem was the food was being shipped out of Ireland to feed the cities in England, and anybody who tried to get their hands on that food ended up being transported to Van Diemen's Land. And if any of you know the song, the famous song, "The Fields of Athenry," that song is all about that. Michael, the person who's in the song, is a representative, if you like, of all of the men of Ireland who ended up, like him, trying to get food for their families by going out and breaking into stores of food before it was shipped out of the country. And if you were caught, well, if you were caught, you stood a good chance of being killed. But if you didn't, you were sent thousands of miles away. What we do know from the famine is that millions died and emigrated. The effects on the Irish language, Irish rural society, and Irish culture were monumental. And in many ways, Ireland has never recovered. Also, and not to be underestimated, is psychological damage. We're now in a situation where we have a virus, and it's been going on for 4 months. In a famine, where people have no food, 6 to 8 weeks, and you have bodies piling up on the streets, on the roads, everywhere you go, there are dead bodies. I mean, the nightmare and the horror of that. So the psychological damage was enormous. And in another sense then, having seen that, the British at that stage were convinced that after that, that Ireland was finally subdued and that it would never rise again. That were their claims. So the land issue then was clearly seen as core to the problem. There were, during the famine period, there was 10 to 12,000 English landlords who owned land, anything from 20 to 100,000 acres, and they had Irish people renting the land. Historically, the land had been taken from Ireland, so land ownership changed from the beginning of the 17th century, from a point where at that stage the Irish would have owned maybe 80 or 90%, down to at its lowest point, if you're Irish and Catholic, there was about 5% ownership in the country. So getting the land back, was still the burning issue. And in some cases, it wasn't just getting, people might have actually settled for something less. The problem was the rents that people were being charged were terrible. You had no security on the land. You could be removed. And particularly if you did if you improve your lot, all that was going to happen if you improved your little shack, your little house, well then at the end of the year, when rents were being reviewed, the rents would go up, and the chances were it would go up to a point where you couldn't afford it and somebody else would come in. So the reality was that people had to choose not to do anything, to let their houses get to the point of basically being hovels as the only way in which they could hope to be allowed to remain. It was tragic, but that was the situation. So from the 1850s, after the famine, new organizations emerged, and their focus was on ending the system of landlordism. And it was a system of landlordism combined with the fact that there had been a government of Ireland that used to meet in Dublin for about 600 years, and that had been removed in the year 1800. So that meant that the people who were elected in Ireland to represent the people, they all met in London. Many of them, if they were, a lot of them never even came back to Ireland, maybe once a year. So the Parnell sisters then, by the 1870s, the National Land League, it was at the front of an agrarian war. At this stage, people had begun to see that, the idea of national liberation could only be achieved if we actually, took on board the real issues that were facing people. And the biggest issue was control of land, because Ireland at this stage was still an agricultural land. There were, the towns were very, very small. So there were a number of people who managed to bring together people who wanted to achieve national independence, but who saw that the only way they could do that was by getting the mass of people behind them. And to get them behind them, they had to stand up and say that we have to sort the situation on the land out. The leadership knew that they would be arrested, if not killed. So what they did was they set up a shadow leadership that was made up of women, Fanny and Anna Parnell. And when the men were arrested, the women continued that organization for the next year and a half after that. And that was first of all, it was important that that happened, and they did an amazing job at that. And that influenced women then, throughout the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years in what could be seen as the Gaelic Revival. From Douglas Hyde, he was the first president in independence, in Ireland after independence. So this is a quote from him. And this gives you an idea, because what he's doing here, he's comparing and contrasting our past and our present. And what he said here was how one of the most reading and literate peoples, the Irish, has become one of the least studious and most unliterary, and how the present art products of one of the quickest, most sensitive and most artistic races on earth are now only distinguished for their hideousness. So the process in Ireland of taking over the country by a foreign power, England at this time, was known as Anglicization. And in the post-famine years, there were a number of issues. One, obviously, was the huge amount of people that were lost. who died, but also there was the drain of people who were leaving. So people were deeply concerned about the rapid loss of the Irish language, because the people who suffered most, and most of the people who died, were the Irish speaking people from the west of Ireland. So that was tragic. Then there was the loss of Irish culture in general, and emigration. There was a sense of despair and helplessness everywhere. The English-based education system at the time, which had been introduced in the 1830s, it didn't allow Irish language, history, culture, art, or sports to be practiced. It had been introduced in the 1830s after the British had realized, or the English had realized, that the Irish were never going to give up speaking their language. The influence of the parents, grandparents, the storytellers, and the rest was always going to keep, the history of Ireland alive. So they introduced a school system to take people away from that, so that they would only learn English language, and the only history that they would learn would be the history of Ireland from the English point of view. To give you an idea, in the school books in the 19th century, this is the kind of nonsense that they were taught. This is a quote from one of the books. "And the east of Ireland is England, where the Queen lives. Many people who live in Ireland were born in England, and we speak the same language and are called one nation." Again, lies, lies, and lies. Even more insidious was this little ditty, as we used to call them, that children were taught to recite. "I thank the goodness and the grace which on my birth has smiled, and made me in these Christian days a happy English child." Now, can you imagine Irish children being forced literally to recite that, to the point that it was embedded in their brains? So the Gaelic League then was an organization set up in the 1880s. And it's the first organization then established which accepted women as members on the same terms as men. And from the beginning, women sat on the executive and all of the major committees to carry out the program. And the organization launched its first manifesto, which was titled "The Necessity for the De-Anglicizing of the Irish Nation." Here was one of the women that was very influential at the time, a woman called Alice Milligan. And she produced this pamphlet, which was called the Shan Van Vocht, which is translates into "poor old woman." And that's a traditional name for Ireland. It's another name that some people will refer to. If they talk about Ireland, they'll say that Ireland was the Shan Van Vocht, and there's songs about that. She was not a Catholic, she was a Methodist. She was an Irish nationalist, a poet and a writer, and she got involved in the Gaelic League. She founded branches of the Irish Women's Association, and she became its first president. And she got involved in a number of literary projects. So, "Ireland shall be free from the centre to the sea, and hurrah, hurrah for liberty, says the Shan Van Vocht." That was the motto. It was adopted by the founders, and that neatly encapsulates the spirit of the monthly journal. And it was intended to operate as a literary factor in the national cause. That's a quote from their founding documents. One of the first things that they worked on was the 100th anniversary of the 1798 rebellion. So it was conceived as a source of inspiration and education. The journal commemorated the centenary, and its founders took an active role in planning, and they used the journal to advertise the activities that were linked to the centenary and to educate people on the significance and wider significance of that event. Now, there were two organizations that, if you like, we could talk about it as in terms of women in the revolutionary struggle. The first one that was formed was Gráinne Ní Mháille, and the second one was Cumann na mBan. Gráinne Ní Mháille translates into Daughters of Ireland, and it was a radical Irish nationalist organization set up by Maud Gonne and other women with the aims of re-establishing the independence of Ireland, encouraging Irish manufacture, and combating Anglicization. And there were a number of people that were involved in that are famous in terms of Irish history. We had Maud Gonne as president, Anne Johnson, Alice Milligan, Constance Markievicz, Helena Maloney, and Catherine Lynn. And there I share with you some images of some of those women. Now, the first activity was an event to counter a visit to Ireland by Queen Victoria. She was coming over as part of a recruitment drive to get Irishmen to enlist in the British Army to fight in the Boer War in South Africa. Now, the event was titled Patriotic Children's Treat, and 30,000 Irish children paraded in the streets of Dublin, which ended with a picnic and anti-recruitment speeches. And then an outcome of the picnic was the establishment of boys and girls clubs to educate them on Irish nationality, language, and history. And the goal of the group was to discourage the reading and circulation of low English literature, and I'm quoting now from a document at the time, the singing of English songs, the attending of vulgar English entertainments at theatres and music halls, and to combat in every way English influence, which is doing so much injury to the artistic taste and refinement of the Irish people. Now, Cumann, which translates into the Irish Women's Council, it's an Irish Republican women's paramilitary organization that was formed in 1914. And it merged with and dissolved the original Daughters of Ireland. And it, in 1916, became an auxiliary of the Irish Volunteers. And it continues to this day as a, if you like, a sister organization to the Irish Republican Army. So although it was otherwise an independent organization, its executive was subordinate to that of the Volunteers. So on the 23rd of April 1916, when the Military Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood finalized arrangements for the famous Easter Rising, it integrated Cumann along with the Irish Volunteers and Irish Citizens Army into the Army of the Irish Republic. So they were a central part of the Army of the Irish Republic. Now, on the day of the Rising, Cumann members, including the woman referenced here, Winifred Carney, she arrived armed with both a Webley revolver and a typewriter, and they took over the general post in the main street in Dublin for the next week. So the majority of women in 1916, they worked as Red Cross workers, couriers, procuring rations. They gathered intelligence, they went on scouting expeditions, they carried dispatches, they transferred arms from dumps across the city. And some members of Cumann were also members of the Citizens Army. And as such, there were combatants in the Rising. So after the Rising, over 70 of them were arrested, and many of them were imprisoned in Kilmainham jail. One of them had a death sentence imposed, that was Constance Markovich, but it was commuted due to her gender. Now, during the Anglo-Irish War, the Cumann members were active. They hid arms, provided safe houses for volunteers. They helped run the Dáil courts and local authorities, because at this stage, during the War of Independence, we had it begun with the formation of an independent underground Irish government, and it set up a parallel state, to counter the English state, which was in control in Ireland. So they had their own courts, set up local authorities, issued licenses, collected taxes, and a lot of that work had to be done by women, because the men, most of the men were fighting, and also the British still had an issue. They had no problems taking a man out and shooting them, but they still had problems about arresting, imprisoning, and roughing up women, although it was done on many occasions. But it did mean that a lot of administrative works for the new Irish government, underground government, could be done by women, and they were very active in that. And then in the Irish elections in May 1921, Constance Markovich, in 1918, the British brought in some new laws as a result of the suffragette movement and the rest. So women were voting for the first time, and Constance Markovich was the first woman elected to the British House of Commons. Now, she was a Republican, Irish Republican, so she never took her seat in the House of Commons. She did take her seat in the underground Irish government, and she became the first Minister for Labour. Now, in 1921, at the next election, she was joined then by three other women: Mary McSweeney, Dr. Ada English, and Kathleen Clark. They were all elected. And that's images for those 3 women. A term that was used for them was female fenians, and they made significant contributions to the cause of Irish self-government by carrying out logistical support work for the male combatants, as well as maintaining continuity in Irish civil society. And that was a very, very important role, because the justification all along, that if Britain were ever asked, you know, what is your justification for being in Ireland, for taking over Ireland, their answer ran along the lines, well, those people couldn't run themselves. They don't have the skills, the talents, they need us. So women, by maintaining the continuity within Irish civil society and continuing their support for the underground Irish government, were demonstrating clearly to the world what nonsense that was for anyone who needed to be told that it was nonsense. Women were also able to work in more clandestine roles, and roles that men were not able to do, as spies. They were able to get jobs in offices where they could get information about the British administration and pass it on. And that was a very important role that they played, intelligence gathering. Now, as a result of all the work done, women incurred much of the brunt of British reprisals, particularly after the IRA entered the guerrilla warfare phase, when it got to the point where they couldn't return to their farms and their villages and towns because the British Army were waiting for them to come and were likely to shoot them on sight. So they were hiding out in the mountains, and they needed supplies. And women had the job of setting up a lot of the I suppose the chains, if you like, the supply chains. But the problem then was when the British, did come into towns and villages, it was mostly women and kids that were there. And the way that the British used to look at it, it was the old situation. Okay, your men think they're being smart. They're not coming home. They're staying up on the mountains. So we can't get them. But you're here and your kids are here. We can burn your house down. And that they're the type of things that they did. So women, in one sense, were convenient targets, particularly for incensed British forces, and doubly so when they were related to people who were either known to be or suspected of being involved in revolutionary activities. So by maintaining then the functional society in the absence of British administration, because there were large parts of the country during the Civil War where the British administration and the police had been driven out. So women had a major role in setting up and keeping civil society going in those ways, so that things like, the mail could be delivered, food could be distributed, just the normal things that go on. And they made themselves indispensable in that. So again, you may read some books who will talk about women's role as being a passive role. But again, that's somebody from the sidelines, seeing it. If you look at and read from the writings of women who participated, you will see that it was not a passive role. Now, there were some people, say like Eamon de Valera. Eamon de Valera refused to allow women to come to, in 1916, he was a commander, and he only wanted women to come so that they could do first aid. And he told them that they couldn't come if they were bringing weapons with them. So they said, well, okay, we're not coming. You better get somebody else to look after you if you get shot. But he was kind of, I suppose, one of a few. Most of the time, women played what the role that they saw fit. So I'm starting classes in September. That's an email address. I don't have a website at the moment. I'm setting one up, but you could use that email address if you want to get details of it. The courses are going to be on a Thursday, starting on the 10th of September. One is on the history of the county of Tipperary, which is an amazing county in Ireland. And then at the moment, I've already started the history from ancient times, and I'm up to it. I've got to the point now in the chronological history where I'm looking at Christianity. So I'm looking at the arrival of Christianity and the role of St. Patrick. So I will get out of here and I will start taking your questions. So I hope you could hear me. I hope the reception was okay for you. I'm going to turn on a light here. I notice it's getting a bit dark. So just excuse me for one moment. Okay, so who's got a question for me?
So Sean, this is Carrie. I did have some patrons over on Facebook ask if we can send them that presentation.
Yes.
So if you can just make sure that we get that, so I can get that over to them.
Okay, I'll send you a copy of it when I'm finished here and you can pass it out. The only thing I would ask people is not to post because again, there's copyright issues and that in relation to, although I have on the sides I have credited everybody, but there's a way you're supposed to do that. I'm supposed to put it on the slide itself, and I haven't done that. But if you're just passing it to friends, that's fine, but not onto onto YouTube or whatever. So, but I get that to you immediately afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much. And so it doesn't seem to be any questions here in Zoom. And I think it looks like all the questions on Facebook and YouTube that I'm seeing are all just in regards to the presentation.
Okay. Okay, somebody, there has to be some brave person out there who's going to start the ball rolling.
Let me see. I'll go ahead and make sure everybody can unmute themselves. Maybe that's it.
Yeah.
Oh, so Sean, someone monitoring our Facebook page is asking if you can please repeat your email address.
Yes, it's my name is Sean Murphy, SeanMurphy 630 @gmail.com.
Okay, yep. Thank you.
That was the time I used to get up, 6:30.
I have a question. Can
Sure.
you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. The talks you mentioned on September 10th, are they also Zoom?
Yes, and their lectures, that's a course. I'm presenting the chronological history of Ireland, from basically 1.7 billion years ago, because I start off with a geological history of Ireland. Then once people arrive, then I've got the ancient history of Ireland. Then I go into the arrival of Christianity, the arrival of the Vikings, the arrival of the Normans, the Tudors, and go through all the issues, the famine, the 1916 rising, right up to 2020. But it takes about 2 years to go through all of that.
So we could check in with the same ID?
Sorry?
So we could check in with the same ID number?
No. If you use my, it'll be on, it'll be a Zoom, but I'll be setting it up as a Zoom meeting. The Zoom address that you have for this one was from the library.
Yes.
But this one, it's one of my courses that I'm running. There'll be people from different parts of the country participating in it. So I send, when people register to do the course, then I send them out, a link.
I see. So we need to communicate with the library first.
Well, or you could use that email address that I've given you there, Sean Murphy 630.
Oh, okay. I understand now.
Yeah, because the library won't be accepting people to register for my courses.
Okay.
So you need to contact me, directly.
I have it now. Thank you.
Okay. And Sean, this is Carrie again. So we have some couple of questions.
Yes.
Lisa asked, She said that the English cultural warfare seems to have extended to Native Americans in starvation and end of the use of the native language, religion, and other aspects of the other culture. So more of a statement than a question. But I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yep, I mean the parallels are there, and in fact the reality is, you know, the English learned how to how to colonize and brutalize Irish people, and then they used those lessons when they came over here. Yeah, because they'd been doing it before they came here. You know, they had been in Ireland for 400 years, and people like Walter Raleigh, for instance. Walter Raleigh arrived in this country after he'd been kicked out of Ireland during a revolt, you know, in Ireland, where he had been, you know, he'd come into Ireland during the time of Queen Elizabeth, along with a lot of other adventurers, you know, and had taken land, confiscated land. But the Irish rebelled, and he managed to get out of Ireland without losing his life. So there were quite a few, you know, of the English personnel that kind of bloodied themselves, if you like, in Ireland and ended up over here. But at a general level, a lot of the strategies and a lot of the policies were tested out, you know, in Ireland. Yeah.
Okay, and then we have actually a couple of questions. So we've got someone on Facebook who had asked about Queen Boadicea, as she wasn't mentioned in the presentation. And then someone on YouTube had asked about, were there anyone mythologically speaking who would be on par with Queen Maeve in importance?
Yep. Well, I mean, Queen, but again, there's different ways of pronouncing it. Queen Boadicea, she was a Celtic queen in Britain, and you know, she fought the Romans. You know, so she lost her life in the 1st century. You know, when they rebelled against the Romans, and unfortunately, you know, they almost had the Romans defeated. They had them surrounded. The Romans only had a couple of thousand, and they had 100,000 people. But their military strategy and tactics were weak, and they ended up losing that battle. And that would have been, you know, a different story for the world if Rome had been defeated at that famous battle with Queen Boadicea. She would have been, yeah, she, let's see, Queen Maeve might have been a bit before her, but would have been within half a century or so of her. Again, the same as with, you know, I suppose the difference is because of the survival of some Roman history. We're able to kind of clarify that she, you know, was a historic figure, whereas Queen Maeve, it's different. You know, you have people in Ireland who would say, and would point out where her burial ground is. Then there's other people who'd say, no, there was never anybody called her. And again, it would take me quite a while to explain that, but in Irish history, we went through a whole period of denial, you know, particularly with the Anglo-Irish historians. They wanted to deny that there was a historic past to Ireland before the English took over Ireland. Basically, we were all savages before the English came. So we couldn't have had a history. We couldn't have had laws. And they tried to, you know, search and find any kind of old Irish documents that could prove them wrong and burn them. And we were very fortunate that in the in the late 17th and early 18th century, that a few scholars managed to track down and find a lot of ancient texts that had been hidden by people, and we're still uncovering them because you know, people built them into the walls of houses. People dug them into caves, you know, to try to make sure that they would survive, because they had to survive. The first thing they had to survive was the Christians, you know, because you know, again, even though St. Patrick, you know, managed to Christianize Ireland in a kind of a humane way, we've no martyrs from that period, but it is said that he himself ordered the destruction of 150 volumes of old Druid works in Ireland. Then the Vikings, when the Vikings came in, they burnt and destroyed everything that they get their hands on. And then when the Normans came in, the same thing. It's kind of standard, you know. If you're taking over a country, you don't want to give any you don't want to give any legitimacy, you know, to the people who were there before. You want to write the history, and the simplest way to do that is to destroy all knowledge of the existing history. And you know that happened in this country.
Yeah. So I have Brenda had asked how many weeks is the course?
I do them in 4-week modules. So every 4 weeks, I take a different topic, so that people can kind of pick and choose. And there are I cover all of the major, you know, events. And if anybody, you know, has got that email and you want to contact me, I can send you out a list. There's about 24 different topics that I do as part of the chronological history. And then I do a history of each county in Ireland. There's 32 counties in Ireland. So I do all of those. And they take a few years to get through. But if you want that information, please send me you know, an email, and I'll send you back the document with the titles of all of the classes that I do. I've just finished one, you know, it took me about 2.5 years to finish one complete set, and now I'm going back around again.
Okay. Is there a cost for that course, someone's asking?
Yes, the classes are about $80.
Okay, perfect. And then, so I have 2 other questions. Sure I'm not missing them. So when was the Irish language taught again officially in the schools? And did it start in the West?
The the language, once we had after the War of Independence, when there was you know, the first post-independence Irish government. So from then on, you know, the Irish language was part of the curriculum. Now it had started before that, you know, and again, it was something that we can be thankful to a number of women for doing. But I think it was 1906. There were a number of women who, believe it or not, you know, in Ireland, they had to get a number of schools to accept teaching Irish as a pilot project. You know.
Yeah.
So that was the way it was reintroduced. Now, that being said, you know, you still had church schools in Ireland, because you had the state schools and then you had church schools. So in the church schools that were run by the Christian Brothers, they would have taught the Irish language and Irish history.
Okay.
It was the ones that were run by the state, which you know, tried to obliterate the language and the history.
So related to that, what challenges does Ireland face currently in respect to rebuilding its culture and independence from the UK?
Well, it's and I think it's something that, you know, people around the world need to kind of take kind of a bearing from, in one sense. You know, we're now at, you know, well, we were at a turning point, and now we're just kind of starting to come out of something that took about 700 or 800 years, you know. And the end result of the colonization of Ireland was to take, you saw the quote there on Douglas Hyde, what he was basically saying, how did this ever happen? How come, you know, because during the period from the 6th to the 9th century, Ireland was known as the Ireland of Saints and Scholars. You know, there were schools all over Ireland. Schooling was free. People were learning, you know, the curriculum, because I do courses on it as well. The curriculum was amazing. There were people coming from all over Europe. So how did a country who was so well educated and was producing scholars to go to Europe, because we had that phenomenon of, you know, people learning in the monasteries and heading off to Europe. How do we get to the point, you know, whereby the 1840s, Ireland was decimated, the people were starving to death, you know, people's culture, you know, people had lost their land, the laws of Ireland had been removed and replaced by laws that were totally anathema. And it's not like just replacing a set of laws that were, if you like, kind of similar. I mean, the difference between Irish law and English law, it's night and day. Also, the social institutions of Ireland were destroyed because, you know, under the conquests of Ireland, the idea of having a normal state, you know, where people had rights, it just wasn't on the cards. I mean, in colonial times, basically what they wanted to do was to come and take everything they could. And if they could get rid of you, well, that was a bonus. Problem was, there was just too many people, but the famine nearly achieved that. And so people say that maybe that was part of what they were doing. And in the early 1830s, there was a scheme in the House of Commons where they wanted to send 3 million Irish people to northwestern Canada and set up an Irish colony there, because they were getting concerned about the growth, you know, of people in Ireland, because the population had exploded for a number of reasons. But so it's the Irish language now is you know, Irish language and culture has come a long way in the last 50 years in particular. I would say, you know, I would expect, say, in about 200 years. For me as an Irishman, 200 years is like tomorrow. You know, I would say, you know, in 200 years, probably Ireland will probably be, you know, bilingual. Most people will speak the language and speak English, you know, as well. I don't imagine we'll ever get back to just speaking Irish. But one of the arguments that's made, you know, is that you can never be a proper Irish person if you don't have your language, because your language contains, you know, within it structures, you know, which allows you to understand yourself, you know, as a person. It's not just words. And it's much, much deeper, because the origin of the English language came out, it was a mishmash of German, of French, Scandinavian, and, you know, and people just kept on throwing in stuff there. So the English language doesn't have the depth, you know, that the languages of ancient, you know, Greece or ancient countries had, because for most of the life of the Irish language, people just used the language, they spoke it, you know, so they had to be able to explain themselves well to be understood. Mm-hmm. They had to make themselves understood. That was the power of the oral tradition. People did not rely upon documents. They didn't trust documents. I mean, that was a large part of it. And documents were only used, you know, where there was little chance that, you know, you could fabricate them. They were used for accounting purposes and for notation and whatever. But, you know, in ancient societies, there were people, and in Ireland, it was hereditary. You know, there were certain families whose job it was to, you know, be able to retell the whole history of your clan from the very first day that clan became a clan, you know. So, and people carry that, and they weren't sidetracked, you know. The brain wasn't getting confused by having to go home every night and watch some makey up thing from Hollywood, you know, which was not related to reality. Everything that they talked about was about reality, past and present, you know. So they were well grounded. Now today, a lot of people don't know the difference between reality and unreality, unfortunately. But in those days, it was there was a high regard for people who could clarify, you know, who knew what, you know, who could tell you the origins of whatever it was at a local level. And that was the whole science in itself, understanding the local landscape and understanding the background to every name that there was in the locality, every place name or whatever. People, you know, so it was a different world. But I think to answer your question, yeah, I think that we're moving in that direction. There's a positive attitude, particularly among young people now. They want to take, you know, independence seriously, and they basically want to be Irish people. They want to create their own culture. And that's a bit of a battle that's going on, because you have kind of, the kind of culture that's coming in through the mass media, that again is difficult, but people now are choosing to send their children, to schools to learn through the medium of Irish. And that's kind of new, and it's expanding. Irish music and Irish dance has never been as strong. And also people can now, earn a living. There was a long time you couldn't really earn a living as an Irish musician or an Irish dancer, but now there's people traveling the whole world dancing, with the kind of river dance shows and all the ones that are outgrowths from that. So there's literally thousands of Irish people around the world involved in bringing those. Probably not today because everybody's back home, quarantined, but hopefully that will all end, they'll get back on the road. So anyway, thank you very much, folks. I hope I managed to give you some sense of the important role that women had played, and just help you to understand, by giving you a few examples of people. I didn't try to stitch it together because there's no logic to it. To try to explain it as a coherent piece would be quite difficult in one night. But I wanted to give you an opener anyway, and hope you learned something from it and enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
It's been very great.
Yep. So contact me, or about any courses. I would send Kerry a copy of tonight's presentation, and she'll send it. Or you can contact me directly, or whatever you wish. And I'll be back on again in a number of weeks. Doing the next one, I think, is on. Oh yeah, the next one is Experiencing Ireland. Through Irish music, dance, history, art, and comedy. So the next one I'll be using a lot of video, embedded video. I won't be talking to you. I'll be talking a little, but I'll be showing you examples of all of those aspects of Irish life. Because again, in terms of the question you asked, part of the reason for doing this one is to show people, that we're not just getting so tied up in watching our TV that we have no sense of an identity of ourselves, because that's always the danger. But
yes.
So good night, everybody, and
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
So Kerry, I will send that to you straight away.
Perfect. And let me just hold on 1 second.